There's something quietly unsettling about the moment a letter lands on the mat that seems, on the surface, completely ordinary, a reminder, a form, a notice from the DVLA, and yet, for many drivers over 60, it carries a weight that isn't always spoken about directly. It's not just about driving, it's about independence, routine, identity in some cases, and I think that's where the conversation really begins. What's interesting is how quickly these kinds of warnings circulate. A headline appears, sometimes phrased in urgent terms, suggesting that a new rule has begun or is about to begin, and suddenly it takes on a life of its own. People start sharing it, questioning it, worrying about it, and beneath that there's a very real anxiety that doesn't always get acknowledged, the fear of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that you may no longer be as free to move through the world as you once were. People start sharing it, questioning it, worrying about it, and beneath that there's a very real anxiety that doesn't always get acknowledged, the fear of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that you may no longer be as free to move through the world as you once were. The thing people are starting to notice is that driving regulations in the UK don't actually change overnight in the dramatic way social media sometimes suggests, but reminders from the DVLA do feel increasingly prominent, especially around age thresholds. At 70, drivers must renew their license, and every 3 years after that. It's straightforward in policy terms, but emotionally it's something else entirely. And honestly, that's where the tension sits. Because on paper, these rules are about safety, about ensuring that drivers remain medically fit, visually capable, and aware enough to be on the road. But in practice, they intersect with aging in a way that feels deeply personal. It becomes less about bureaucracy and more about self-perception. You can almost feel the duality in how people respond. Some accept it as a reasonable safeguard, a sensible structure in a modern road system that has to account for changing physical ability over time. Others feel an unease, as though the system is quietly stepping closer into their personal autonomy. Neither reaction is entirely wrong, and maybe that's the point. It's strange, because when you speak to older drivers, many will tell you that they don't feel different from how they did at 50 or 55. The body may have changed in subtle ways, but the sense of capability often remains intact in their own minds. And so when external systems introduce checks, renewals, declarations, it can create a disconnect between how someone feels and how they are assessed. The conversation seems to be shifting towards something broader here, not just about DVLA rules, but about how society manages age in general. At what point do we introduce oversight? At what point does precaution become restriction? And who gets to decide where that line sits? There's also a practical layer to this that often gets overlooked. Many of these reminders are tied to medical conditions that become more common with age. Eyesight deterioration, slower reaction times, medication that can affect alertness. From a regulatory standpoint, it makes sense. Roads depend on collective responsibility. 1. Driver's ability is not isolated from everyone else's safety. But I keep coming back to the emotional response, because even when rules are logical, they still land emotionally. A reminder from the DVLA isn't just administrative. It can feel to some like a quiet audit of capability, a moment where independence is being reviewed. And of course, there are opposing perspectives that deserve attention. Some argue that the current system is already too lenient, that self-reporting is insufficient, and that more frequent mandatory testing should be introduced earlier, not just at 70. Others argue the opposite, that age-based thresholds risk unfairly generalizing a diverse population of drivers, many of whom are perfectly safe well into later life. Both arguments carry weight, and neither fully resolves the underlying tension. What's also worth noticing is how modern communication shapes the perception of urgency. A warning can feel like a rule change, even when it is simply guidance or reminder, and in an environment where information spreads quickly and often without context, nuance is the first casualty. People react to tone before they verify detail. And maybe that's part of what makes this topic so revealing. It sits at the intersection of policy, aging, trust in institutions, and personal autonomy. It's not just about whether someone can legally drive, it's about how society signals transitions in life stages. I keep coming back to the human side of it. Imagine receiving that reminder and sitting quietly with it for a moment, not because you intend to ignore it, but because it asks you to reflect on something you might not have wanted to consider just yet. That slow recognition that systems are built around averages, not individuals. There's a growing feeling that these moments will become more frequent as populations age, more structured reminders, more periodic checks, more digital systems replacing informal assumptions of ability, and while that may improve safety and consistency, it also changes the emotional texture of aging itself. And yet it would be unfair to frame this purely as restriction. For many, these systems also provide reassurance. Knowing that other drivers have met the same standards can make the road feel safer. Knowing that there are checks in place can build trust in a system that otherwise relies heavily on personal honesty. So we are left with a kind of balance that is never fully settled, safety on one side, autonomy on the other, and in between millions of individual experiences that don't always fit neatly into policy categories. The conversation, I think, is not really about whether the DVLA is introducing something entirely new overnight. It's about what these reminders represent in a wider cultural sense. A reminder that time moves forward in structured checkpoints, even when individuals don't feel ready for them. And perhaps that's what makes this linger. It isn't the rule itself, it's the recognition it forces, a quiet moment of self-assessment triggered not by choice but by system. And honestly, maybe the most important question isn't about the rule at all. It's about how we, as a society, navigate the space between care and control, between protection and independence, and whether we are comfortable with the systems we build to manage that fragile balance. And there is another layer that often sits just beneath the surface of these conversations, one that doesn't always make it into the official language of policy. It's the administrative friction of modern life. For many over 60, dealing with online forms, identity verification systems, and increasingly digital-only processes can feel like an entirely separate challenge layered on top of the rules themselves. What's interesting is how this changes the meaning of something as simple as a license renewal. It isn't just a check of eligibility anymore. It becomes an interaction with a system that assumes a certain level of digital fluency, and while many navigate it without difficulty, others find themselves depending on family members or navigating long phone queues, or simply feeling left behind by processes that have moved faster than their daily routines. And I think that's where a quiet inequality sometimes appears, not in intention but in access, because when a system becomes more digital, it can become more efficient, yes, but also more selective in who finds it easy to engage with it, and that subtle difference shapes how rules are experienced, even when the rules themselves are identical for everyone. There's also the question of scams and misinformation, which have become part of the landscape around DVLA-related communication. Fake messages, misleading emails, and urgent-looking texts claiming to require immediate payment or action have created an environment where trust itself becomes fragile. People are told to be cautious. But constant caution can also create fatigue, a sense that every message must be second-guessed. And so even genuine reminders can sometimes be met with hesitation. That erosion of automatic trust is something institutions are increasingly having to reckon with, because the clarity of official communication is no longer guaranteed in the way it once was. The emotional impact of all this is not always dramatic. It is often subtle, a moment of pause before booking a journey, a slight reconsideration of independence, a conversation with a family member about whether it is still necessary to drive long distances. These are not always decisions forced by policy, but they are influenced by the atmosphere that policy creates. And maybe that's what makes aging in a regulated society so complex. It isn't a single threshold moment, it's a series of small signals, reminders, and reassessments that accumulate over time. Each one on its own feels manageable. Together, they form a narrative that people interpret in very personal ways. There are also geographical dimensions to this that matter more than they are sometimes given credit for. In rural areas, driving is not a convenience in the same way it might be in urban centers. It is essential. A reminder to renew a license there carries a different kind of weight because the alternatives are not always practical or accessible. Public transport may be limited, distances are greater, options are fewer. So when policy is discussed in abstract terms, it can sometimes miss how unevenly its effects are felt across different communities. The same rule can sit very differently depending on context, and that context shapes how it is emotionally received. And I keep coming back to the idea that most people are not resisting safety measures themselves. What they are responding to is the feeling of being periodically assessed, categorized, and measured against standards that feel external to their own lived experience. There is a tension between self-knowledge and institutional verification. You might feel perfectly capable of driving. You might have done so for decades without incident, and yet the system still asks you to confirm, to declare, to occasionally prove. That is not inherently unreasonable, but it is psychologically significant. The future of this area may well move further towards technology-based monitoring, from in-car assistance systems to potential usage-based assessments. And while that could improve safety, it also raises further questions about privacy, autonomy, and how much observation is embedded into everyday life. And honestly, it feels like we are only at the beginning of that discussion. Because beneath all of this, there is a more human question that doesn't go away. How do people experience dignity as they age within systems designed to keep them safe? And how do we ensure that safety does not unintentionally become something that feels like quiet restriction? There may not be a single answer to that, but the conversation itself matters because it reveals what we value when we design rules that touch ordinary life so directly, and maybe that's where this whole discussion lands, not in certainty but in awareness, a recognition that even the most ordinary reminders can carry meanings far larger than the words printed on them. And that, in a way, is what makes this topic linger longer than expected.